There is a mistake, or should I say a set of mistakes, that is consistently and persistently made by many people in the online ideas community. This set of mistakes seems particularly persistent among white, male, college-educated thinkers. And while the sundry individual intellectual mistakes it contains is very diverse, the collection nevertheless has a name. This collection of mistakes is called individualism. Now, I've talked to a number of individualists and liberalists online, from Sargon of Akkad to Zarathustra's serpent. And it seems as though this mistake is really born out of a misapplication of an Enlightenment principle and ideas that Enlightenment thinkers described. In that sense, there is sort of an implicit Motte and Bailey that often goes with discussing the concept of individualism. In one sense, there is the Motte, the way our founding fathers conceptualized individualism, which in our current age is totally uncontroversial, save for perhaps the most radical far-left and far-right circles. And then there is the Bailey, how we've come to understand individualism in the 20th century. And I notice many times when engaging with individualists and liberalists, there is a switch back and forth between these two concepts. Now, I want to make something very, very, very clear here before I go on. I do not think that this Motte and Bailey dichotomy is being done dishonestly. The liberalists and individualists are trying to make good faith arguments, but they do not see the mistake that they are making, because there is this implicit equivocation between the two concepts of individualism. And unlike strategic equivocation performed by the left, if the mistake is not corrected, it will ultimately resolve to the detriment of the very liberal individualists who practice it. As someone who's trying to help people still in the liberal individualistic mind trap, I want to be very clear that I'm doing this in good faith, for their benefit. And as such, I want to take a look at individualism, in its modern form that is, and then point out where the mistakes are being made, so that people can understand and learn from the errors that I think are so thoroughly littered throughout this concept of human behavior. And very recently, I saw a video published on my subscription feed, which provided me with just such a teachable moment. I'm referring here to Danny Duchamp's recent video, Big Scary Collectives versus Helpless Individuals, of which I have linked in the description. In this video, Danny Duchamp, who from what I know of him is a liberalist, goes over some of the recent critiques of individualism and growing popularity of collectivism and tribalist ways of viewing the world. Within the video, he attempts to re-clarify what individualism means in the strong sense, and provides a very intellectually honest defense of the proposition of individualism. Now, Danny Duchamp is a smart fellow. I have a lot of respect for him, and for this reason, I think this particular video is the perfect starting point for understanding the problems with the individualistic philosophy, why people appeal to collectives and need collectives in order to operate in any kind of realistic way, and how I myself learned to stop worrying and love the corporation. Before I go on with this video, I probably should issue a disclaimer. While I like Danny Duchamp and I want to start a conversation with him in particular, this video is not designed to be a quick response, a direct message to the YouTuber in question. Rather, I want to use this response video as a springboard for explaining why people like myself, after being liberal individualists for a very long time, walked away from the construction and from the pattern of thought, and why collectives and collective models are very, very important when understanding the world and planning for the future. As such, when I respond to Duchamp's arguments, I'm very likely to take long digressions in explanation, and perhaps at the end we'll arrive at some useful principles going forward. I'm going to try to Iron Man Duchamp's arguments as much as I can. And while I cannot necessarily control for genuine and honest misunderstanding, this is an attempt to get to the bottom of things, to critique the core principles. So with that said, I'm going to begin with Danny Duchamp's video, which starts with a digression about the YouTube community and leads into an acknowledgement that there is a growing interest in collectivism and criticism of individualism.
When the topic is no longer these obviously wrong people social justice warriors, they no longer really have such a grounded idea of why they'd call themselves an individualist, and many of them no longer do. A lot of people are starting to say, well, you know what? The world is just tribalizing. People are forming groups. We can't, as atomized individuals, not working together, not having a common sense of identity, not having a common cause, we can't hope to compete with them. So therefore, we're going to need to become collectivists too.
Now, I want to say here that it is very good that Danny Duchamp acknowledged this, the fact that people are turning away from individualism for purely pragmatic constructions. Now, of course, Duchamp wants to defend individualism and ultimately will in this video, but this is an important starting point, and the point where I will begin the first of my longer digressions. Before we understand individualism, we have to understand collectivism. Why do people organize? Why do people collectivize? Now, at first, this might seem like a much too general question, or even a stupid question, but I think by answering it at this stage, we'll have a good basis going forward in understanding the problems with the individualistic argument. So I think we can return to the very basic question. Why do individuals, why do organisms organize and form into collectives and into communities? Now, for myself as a person who believes in spirituality, I think this question has two answers. The first one, and the religious answer, is that we are compelled morally and through the will of the divine to organize, to seek the greater good, to find commonality in community, and to glorify what is true, good, and beautiful. But of course, this is completely non-scientific. And so there is another and much more materialistic answer to the question asked, and that is that organisms, living creatures, collectivize and group into communities for power, for control over their environment, and for survival. This is the answer you'll get from any Darwinian scientist. This is the answer you'll get from any biologist. And if for a moment we are able to exclude spiritual, moral, and religious answers from consideration and tackle just the descriptive understanding of the universe through science, I think we can properly tackle the question of individualism versus collectivism. Individual organisms collectivize for strength, collectivize for power, collectivize for survival. They come together because together they are stronger. The many is more powerful than the one. If we could pause here and introduce two rather ridiculously simple examples that I'm sure Danny Duchamp would agree were legitimate instances of collectivism. Compare myself as a human, a multicellular organism, to an equivalent mass of single-cell organisms, say a lake filled of bacteria or pond scum. Now, certain pathogens and bacteria designed to exploit multicellular organisms notwithstanding, the comparison immediately shows that the multicellular organism is more powerful. I can form collective action. I can, with my cells all working in conjunction, exert more force. I could execute a plan to destroy the lake filled of bacteria or parameciums, where it is very, very, very unlikely that the group of single cellular organisms would do the same in reverse. Another slightly less ridiculous example is a government with an organized military and the ability to project force, contrasted against a group of individuals or families who are armed. As we see from history, the collective force always wins out. The organization is stronger than those who are atomized. Now, is this a universal principle? Are collectives always stronger? Certainly that isn't the case, even though on aggregate the general rule applies that more cooperation equals stronger force. Danny Duchamp explores some of the exceptions to this rule.
Now, first of all, I should point out that this charge that individuals, all atomized and just working for their own purposes, are never going to be as successful as a cohesive collective is just plain wrong a lot of the time.
Now, there is some truth to this. Disaggregation is important. There is a reason why individual autonomy exists in the natural world. But this far from dethrones the general rule about collective power organizations, which I think shines through in Danny Duchamp's examples that he lists to support this claim.
For example, consider guerrilla warfare tactics. Often a decentralized force, one without a cohesive command structure, is going to be more effective and more efficient than a more regimented, more collectivist in this sense, force. The reason, of course, being that the individuals, the so-called atomized individuals, can be far more adaptive to their current circumstances.
Now, Danny Duchamp starts out with a particularly weak example, in my opinion. Certainly, guerrilla armies are disaggregated, they're localized, they're disparate, but they are still collectives, they are still operating under a command structure. Almost all guerrilla armies have authority systems in them. Individual guerrilla members sacrifice them for the greater cause. There is an organized political goal. And when it comes to the example of the Viet Cong, which I think Danny Duchamp is implicitly alluding to in this example, we know for a fact that in addition to having an implicit authority and command structure, this organization most likely had an explicit collective command structure organized by North Vietnam. But of course, luckily for us, Duchamp goes on to give a much better example next.
Or consider the free market. Consider the fact that individuals pursuing their own self-interests has been shown to be a far more productive way of producing everything that a society needs than attempting some kind of top-down, planned economy.
Now, this next example is a lot better. The concept of the market as a driving force in human affairs and in human actions was one of the motivating inputs and motivating observations for Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith to conceptualize an idea of individualism as we know it today. The idea is generally that inside some organized political body where security concerns are taken care of, directly here answering the collectivist concern about organized military apparatuses, individualism in a society like this can be used to procure the greatest good for all. The idea generally being that individual greedy decisions taken inside a marketplace will create implicit incentives that will lead to more socially cohesive and productive behavior and disincentivize destructive, antisocial, and criminal behavior. And from this perspective, individualism starts looking good. It looked very compelling to Adam Smith, and various models of this form of individualism were incorporated into future models of liberalism and liberal society. However, if we cut liberal society open and look at it even a little bit to see how it works, we'll understand immediately that this concept of individualism is not as thoroughgoing as we might imagine, and Danny Duchamp goes on immediately to reference just one of these features.
However, I totally accept that there are many situations where a cohesive group is more effective. For example, one of the companies within that free market. That would need to be a cohesive group.
I'm really glad that here Danny Duchamp mentions the corporation, because the corporation follows the development of liberal society and our notion of individualism right from the start, right from its beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries. The corporation is, in many ways, the engine of the global economy, in many ways, the engine of the national economy, and it is indisputably a collective. Here I want to stop and address a simplified version of the individualistic argument. Not necessarily the exact point Duchamp is making in this video, but I think asking the question and partially answering it here will start getting us thinking on the right track to answering the stronger case for individualism that Duchamp is trying to bring in this video. The question I want to ask to the pure individualist is this: if the free market is indeed the ne plus ultra of individualism working out to the good of all parties concerned, why do corporations exist? Why is collectivization needed, not just in rare circumstances, but as a foundational force to the economy itself? Couldn't things be done just as transactions between individuals? I will remind people here that the definition of a corporation comes from the word corpus, body, and this does describe what a corporation is. A corporation is literally the collectivization of many people's interests into one common body that society treats like an individual for legal purposes. So why does this body exist when it is purely a collective construction? Now, I think for a lot of anarcho-capitalists, for a lot of socialists who may not have given this question enough consideration or have read enough about the historical need for these objects to exist, will give some conspiracy theory answer that corporations were created by the powerful to pursue nefarious interests, for the general detriment of humanity. But these conspiracy theories aside, in the real world, we have to understand the reasons for the corporation to exist to begin with. In short, the corporation exists for 3 reasons. The first one being to protect and contain certain valuable things that are usable and really only valuable at a collective level. The second reason the corporate form exists as a collective is to properly understand the constituent rights and responsibilities of groups that possess such valuable assets. And the third and final reason the corporation exists is to make sure that we can observe, control, and confront collective action when it manifests in pursuit of a collective interest. Now, of course, these 3 reasons are incredibly abstract, incredibly broad, and I'm sure people watching this will want me to explain. Indeed, I will, but I think I can explain them best by going through Duchamp's video and confronting his particular arguments for individualism. With these reasons for the corporate form to exist, with these reasons for a collective form to exist generally, we can look at Duchamp's arguments and see if it really holds up as a reason for individualism. And first, before we go on, it's important to acknowledge that Danny Duchamp isn't arguing that there can be no collective action, period. He does admit this.
In these situations, you might say that, well, there you can't be an individualist, there collectivism always defeats individualism. This seems to me to be a little strange. It doesn't appear to me to be responding to any kind of individualism that's ever really been espoused by anyone. I don't think anyone means that we shouldn't work together when they say they're an individualist. We can, as individuals, voluntarily join groups and make sure that our common interests in that group are served by taking group actions, and that doesn't stop us from being individualists.
And with that, people watching this video might wonder if there's any difference between my position and that of Danny Duchamp's. Luckily, he goes on to explain, in no uncertain terms, what he means by individualism.
Maybe you think that I'm just saying that everything's individualism, so let me just be totally clear about what I mean when I say I'm an individualist. I mean that only individuals and not collectives have value. Only individuals and not collectives have rights, and only individuals and not collectives take action. We sometimes will describe groups or collectives as taking actions, having rights, or having value, but this is only ever, if it's meaningful, something we're saying metaphorically or to simplify. Really, it is the individuals who make up the collective or are served by the collective who have the rights, who have the value, and who take the actions.
And here, of course, I totally disagree. Because if we return to our example of the corporation, if we return to our example of the multicellular organism, and if we return to our example of the militarized body politic, we will see that these 3 reasons, while compelling in some contexts, while compelling in some dimensions of society, are ultimately a massive misunderstanding of the relationship between the collective and the individual. And by examining each in turn, we can understand exactly how the corporate form works, and why I think the individualist arguments ultimately come up short. Let's start with Duchamp's first principle.
First of all, only individuals have value. Only individuals carry moral weight.
So Duchamp's first point is that only individuals have value, and at this point we need to pause and really take stock of what's being said here. Because I think there is an implicit emotional switcheroo going on that I'm not so sure even Danny Duchamp himself is aware of. And that is the switch between moral value and utilitarian physical value, value in the power sense. Now, remember at the outset when I said there were 2 reasons for organisms to collectivize, the first one being a moral and spiritual reason, and the second being a utilitarian consideration. It is true that there is, in a moral and spiritual sense, value to the individual, just as there is a moral command in almost any mainstream religion to seek the good of the collective. In fact, in Christianity generally, and in Protestantism to an insane degree, there is an emphasis on the individual, both in a moral sense and in a moral value sense. The individual comes first when it comes to moral action and moral value, even though this individual has to contend with collective obligation and spiritual duty. This is best embodied in the Christian concept of the soul, the individual eternal nature that we all possess. And I think it might be worthwhile here to point out that much of the compelling moral nature of only individuals have value may in fact come from the fact that as Westerners, as people who came from Christendom, we immediately find this notion of individual salvation to be compelling, to be spiritual, to be true. But I'm not so sure that in any intellectually serious sense, Danny Duchamp can hang his hat in this corner. For all of the individualism in Christianity, at the end of the day, in Orthodox Christianity, in real Christianity, it is balanced against collective considerations and greater spiritual obligations. You can't have one without the other. If we want to move into a moral and metaphysical debate about how humans should operate, then I think Danny Duchamp is perfectly welcome to debate the theology of individual salvation and individual moral worth against different theological concepts of communitarianism. But since I get the sense that Danny Duchamp is coming from a secular background and would not really like to participate in such abstract philosophical conversations that involve spirituality in objective terms, since I get the sense that this entire conversation of individualism versus collectivism exists in the modern context, where we're all methodologically assuming materialism as the default operating principle. I'm going to take from all of this that the moral digression that only individuals have value in some metaphysically ethical sense to be not a serious argument, to be more or less an emotional appeal on the part of Duchamp. Insofar as his argument, individuals are the only ones that have value, is being made in any serious sense, I'm going to take it to mean that only individuals have utilitarian value, that only individuals have materialistic value, that only individuals have any kind of quantifiable utility we can process in the real world with materialistic tools. However, I don't think that this construction helps Duchamp's argument at all, for the simple reason that it is manifestly false. Now, the example Danny Duchamp gives to show that only individuals have value and not collectives is a rather cute toy example of Islamism forcing people to become suicide bombers and go on jihad, presumably for the greater good of Islam the religion, totally abstracted and with no relationship to the individual good of the people who make up Islam.
If there is some collective, like let's say Islam, for example, that is totally benefited by all of its constituent members suffering terribly, like every single Muslim could be suffering, but because it's such a terrible system for individuals, but that suffering of those individuals will make them all really agitated and they'll go off and commit acts of terrorism and therefore help to spread Islam via the sword, as it always has been spread. Now, that is good for the collective, it helps propagate the collective, but it is bad for every individual because that collective hurts individuals.
Now, certainly this is a possibility. There may be some collective organizations that operate to the detriment of all individuals involved. There may be some collective forms that are totally parasitic. But from my point of view, and I think from people's point of view generally, if they think about this for more than 5 minutes, these examples of totally parasitic collectives are the exception and not the rule. Let's take the ridiculous toy examples I brought up of collectivism right at the beginning of this talk: the multicellular organism and the militarized body politic. Now, does the multicellular organism benefit the cells that compose it? And does the militarized body politic benefit the individuals that constitute it? At a very, very superficial level, the answer is yes. And immediately the individualists will react, look, we've been vindicated. If the collective is good for the members, then we can justify it on an individualistic basis. But if we have any nuance to our understandings of these organizations, we immediately come to a very, very different picture of what's going on. Let's start with the example of the multicellular organism. Is it true that all cells benefit from the collectivity in the body? Well, obviously not. My skin cells are dying continuously for the greater protection of my body. If it was invaded by a virus, a number of T cells would sacrifice themselves in order to protect the greater health of the collective. I even have entire organs dedicated, like the pancreas, to produce chemicals only useful to cells in entirely different parts of the body. Certainly there is collective good in this sense, but it is not a collective good that we can put in individual terms, at least insofar as the cell is concerned. The sacrifices are all being made at the cellular level, but the goods and the value being obtained, in a materialistic sense, of course, can only be conceptualized at the collective level. The same thing is true for a body politic that is militarized. Individual soldiers and military commands sacrifice themselves for the greater collective, and what they obtain is oftentimes very, very difficult to conceptualize as something individuals benefit from. Take the example of a border wall, which many soldiers will die to protect, but whose benefits are more or less collective. Individuals living far from the wall, whose property is nowhere in the path of the barbarians, might not physically benefit in any given way, but still the security of the society as it marches forward in time, as it behaves in collectivity, is beneficial to the individuals, despite the fact that there are individual sacrifices. And this returns us once more again to the first reason why corporations exist inside a free market, and that is to hold collectively valuable things, collective properties that are lucrative on the large scale, but cannot be kept or operated on the individual scale. A pancreas is no use to a cell. A border wall is of no use to a farmer. And in isolation, an industrial strength lathe or other manufacturing tool is of no use to an individual shareholder. However, when this property is collectivized, it becomes something that has utility. It becomes something that can obtain power for the collective good of the people who own it. Therefore, we have demonstrated in a very, very real way how collectives have value, how collectives possess value, at least in any way it interacts with the material world. But I will go on and let Danny Duchamp make his next point.
Only individuals have rights. Collectives, groups do not.
So Duchamp's next point has to do with rights, and already I see that we are in danger of falling into the spiritual moralistic trap we addressed previously. Once more, in our modern conception of rights, there is a sense that what we were talking about is an oughtness, is a moral duty we have to the universe, something that we owe nature or nature's God. This is one definite meaning of the word right, but not one that I think atheists or secularists really want to get into if they're making an argument in an objective sense. So, for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to treat right as if it were the legal construction, as if it were the actual guarantees and rules governments set up for themselves in their ordinary operation of power in the real world. This will dodge around any complicated questions of morality and spirituality that I think just muddy the waters. And here Duchamp has an example of his idea of individual and collective rights being contrasted.
Now for this one, I want you to consider a white nationalist. Let's say that your white nationalist thinks that the white race has a right to its own nation. I, as an individualist, would say no, it does not. However, individual white people do if they voluntarily choose to, and they voluntarily do this without violating the rights of others. They have the right to construct a nation for themselves and only allow other white people into it.
Now here we can see the word voluntary playing a very, very large role in Duchamp's construction of the distinction between good individualistic rights and the evil collective will. But ultimately, I'm not so sure how useful this distinction is. When we're talking about the formation of nation-states, very little is voluntary. Most of us, if not all of us, live on countries that were physically and violently conquered. With a very few exceptions, countries, as they exist right now, are usually built on the bones of another people, with a history of conquest and brutality. There is nothing voluntary about that process, as it actually existed in the real world. Of course, Duchamp might be speaking in an ideal sense, so I will let him go forward with that argument.
Think of the grounds that white nationalists may say that the white race has a right to its own nation. You might say that therefore it's totally acceptable to kick individuals out of that nation because they're violating the white race's right to its own nation. But in actual fact, it's not acceptable to kick individuals off of land that they own, that they acquired voluntarily.
Now, at this point, I'm in a very uncomfortable position. As a critic of the alt-right and forms of racial nationalism, I have used this very example as a litmus test against people who try to justify callous acts that violate human dignity. That is a moral and spiritual rule I have going forward. But I think we need to distinguish this from the claim when it comes to the material world, when it comes to actual history. And here again, there is just no historical ground to say this is true. Governments issue rights to citizens. Governments issue rights to collectives sometimes. But when it comes to seizing land, building nations, and establishing hard control over resources, none of these things called rights make an inch of difference. We can hardly think of a single war in which individual property rights and individual rights to life were kept intact. And so, this concept of individual rights, in the material sense at least, acts as a mechanism that blinds us to larger struggles for power that exist on a supranational scale, that exist on a pre-societal scale. Now, of course, I can anticipate some counter-objections coming from moderate libertarians and liberalists at this stage. The argument being, of course, that individualism and rights in the sense that Danny Duchamp is talking about them, in the sense that most liberals talk about them, occur after we establish national security, after wars are finished, after the proper authority is established, after essentially some legitimate government has a monopoly on force, and we can talk about governing ourselves to the benefit of all concerned. And certainly this is a good place to start. This is where our founding fathers started. This is where the great Enlightenment thinkers started, but it leaves some critical dimensions out. As I've mentioned before, collectivization exists as a means of organizing power. It exists as a means of owning things collectively that can benefit the group and to exert power against rivals to that group. And this utility of collectivization doesn't just suddenly turn off the second someone shows up and claims the monopoly of power. Power struggles go on inside of the society as people collectivize to seize more and more of the resources and to possess collective goods that can only be benefited from as a group. Now, done properly, this benefits society. But it doesn't take much for things to go wrong. The obvious example being something like a crime syndicate, a business run to the benefit of the stakeholders, but to the detriment of society at large. If these collectives are allowed to grow and grow and grow, unharassed by the overarching government, eventually they will develop into warlords. And if those warlords grow and grow in power, you will have a civil war on your hands in very short order. Collectivization and power-seeking goes on within societies, even when there is a well-established government. This can be incredibly dangerous, so all effective governments pay close attention to collectives forming inside their own borders, be they political identity groups, corporations, mafiosos, or any other power-sharing arrangement. In Europe, at the end of the Enlightenment, and in particular in England, under what is known as English common law, a lot of the solution of this collectivization problem was to enact a legal system with incredibly broad concepts of culpability and liability. If people were caught in a conspiracy to commit murder or to assassinate a public figure, each of the conspirators could be held highly culpable and receive very, very harsh punishments, even if they had not been the ones behind the trigger individually. Similarly, in civil law, if a joint financial venture or a partnership went all in on a project that ended up costing the public or some third party financial damages, each of the members of that partnership or combine would be held 100% liable for recuperation of the costs that their actions caused. This, in essence, was a way of controlling collective harm and the harms that could come from conspiracies and combines, while still working it into a moral and legal system that only held individuals accountable. Basically, for any collective, guilt and liability went radiating ever outwards, and it was very hard to organize. Of course, this creates a reciprocal problem, which is how do we manage necessary collectivization, necessary organizations of relationships that can work to the benefit benefit of the public good. Something was needed to facilitate, and here is where our friend the corporation finally emerges on the world stage to solve this problem of liability and culpability in collective action. The solution of collective action inside a legal system only recognizing individual culpability is to incorporate the members of a collective endeavor. In translation, to move them into one body, into one corpus, so that this hypothetical body could be judged under individual legalistic principles. The construction of this legal system and its necessity is essential to understand in any proper description of collective action in the West. The formation of the corporation allowed governments the ability to recognize collective rights, if only implicitly, and therefore, by extension, to allow collective endeavors to actually achieve large ends that could not be achieved individually. Moreover, and on the converse side, the existence of the corporation allowed governments to try collective action. The danger in all collectivization and in all organization is that the collective can act in concert and then only receive repercussions as individuals, thus shielding some from any liability in the process. But the existence of the explicit corporation allowed this to be partially confronted. The corporation allows us to understand collective action, to see it, for it to be explicit in our society and not hidden behind power relations. The corporation is proof that in a physical sense, in our society, we recognize collective rights in a very, very real way. And moreover, the reason for the corporation is to understand collective action, which brings me to Danny Duchamp's final point.
Now the final one, and the one upon which the other two rest, is that only individuals take actions. Collectives do not take actions per se.
Now, in many ways, I wish Danny Duchamp had started with the question of collective action, because he is right that this is where all other objections stem from. The question of action is what motivates the question of value in the material sense, and it is what motivates the question of rights in the collective sense. But I'll let Duchamp continue.
The reason that the other two rest upon this one is because, well, what is a right other than the moral authority to take some action? If the thing in question cannot take actions, how on earth could we say that it has rights? And if it has no rights, how on earth could we say that it has any moral weight, any moral value whatsoever?
Now, of course, I have to pause here. I think that I have demonstrated in my last 2 points that yes, indeed, collectives have value in the materialistic sense, and yes, indeed, our legal system, both on the external front with foreign governments and on the internal front with unions and corporations, does recognize collective rights. Yet, still there seems to be a disagreement, and immediately it seems hard to pinpoint the source, whether we are just looking at different elements of our society or if Duchamp's just not seeing where what I'm pointing to actually exists, until he goes on and demonstrates what I think is the source, the fundamental source of his mistake in this video, and perhaps as an individualist generally.
So that's why individuals being the only things that can take actions is the primary justification for my calling myself an individualist. You cannot assign group blame. The blame goes to the individuals. The only time when it would seem like there's group blame is if every single individual in some group is guilty of that thing. And then it's still just individual blame that I'm simplifying by calling group blame.
And I think here we finally at long last come to the rudimentary error laid bare. Again, I think this is an honest mistake, but it is a critical mistake, and I see it again and again. For all intents and purposes, in any meaningful sense, there is such a thing as collective action. And I want to pause here and take a lengthy digression to demonstrate why this is the case, because I think it is essential to understand. And let's return to our toy examples of the multicellular organism, the militarized political body, and the corporation. Now, putting aside any ethical or spiritual or metaphysical conceptions, talking simply about the materialistic universe as we experience it, I, myself, as a multicellular organism, am nothing but a constituent organization of other living creatures, of other cells. When I do something like speak into the microphone, or use my mouse, or press my keyboard, it is the collectivity of cells, the collectivity of organs working together. We could say that there is nothing called the distributist pressing the key or speaking into the microphone, and that it is only the happenstance that many cells are all cooperating to do this at once. But to use this model blinds us to the reality that to know what a human is to understand that it is many cells working collectively. And to have a model for a human, a model that is at all accurate, should give you the understanding, the expectation that there will be collective action on the part of the cells that constitute it. Ridiculous examples are always easier, as the great G.K. Chesterton said. So let's take a ridiculous example. Suppose I, as a human individual, were to go to a country where people, humans, were modeled not as individuals, but as groupings of cells, as groupings of different organelles, each with their own interest. It would be immediately apparent that no such society could ever function in a real sense, because there could never be any accountability at the human level. Say, for instance, I was to take a gun and shoot 6 people, 6 of my rivals who were competing with me in some business venture in this hypothetical country where people were seen as collections of constituent parts like organs and cells. On trial for the murders of these other people, I could then claim that it was not myself who was guilty of the crime, but rather my finger that pulled the trigger of the gun. The collectivity of the distributist had shed thousands of cells in between the moment where I killed the humans and the moment where I stood trial. Would it even be fair to charge the new cells for the crimes of their ancestors? The construction is ridiculous, and of course this is not meant to be a strong man of the individualist's position. It is an example that just demonstrates how reducing everything to constituent elements is ridiculous. But perhaps we might take a slightly less ridiculous example that some rather extreme individualists might actually agree with, that of the nation-state. Now, take the United States, the largest military power, the largest force of violence on the world stage. On the outside, it appears to be more or less inassailable, and certainly, in any kind of conventional or nuclear conflict, it could completely annihilate a much smaller and poorer country like Bangladesh. Yet, borrowing an example from Mencius Mollbug, I can construct a mechanism by which Bangladesh can triumph politically and militarily over the United States without changing any of the resource discrepancies or population differentials between the two countries, just by changing the perceptions of the collectivities. Say, for instance, we deleted in the minds of both the American government and the American people the distinction between a Bangladeshi and an American, and the distinction between a Bangladeshi military officer and a Bangladeshi soldier and an American one. Then, after this perception was deleted, we reinserted the population of Bangladesh and the military of Bangladesh into the United States and fully integrated it. Now, keep in mind, both Bangladeshi people and the Bangladeshi military would be able to see the collective difference. Moreover, for purposes of this thought experiment, we can imagine that both collectivities, on average, are working for the overthrow of the United States government and the total victory of Bangladeshi interests. In this scenario, working inside United States law, and possibly outside of it in some contexts, the Bangladeshi contingent could work for its collective interest, whereas the American government and the American collectivity would only be able to recognize these people as individuals. Thus, the Bangladeshi cell could stockpile weapons, accumulate power, share resources, purchase political and corporate power, just as any American citizen, and with full protection of their rights. Moreover, the Bangladeshi contingent could operate criminal ventures and military operations outside the United States law, and upon apprehension, the only thing that would result would be a criminal punishment for the individuals involved, which would generally not spill over to the Bangladeshi community or the larger collective project that we hypothetically imagine them having in this thought experiment. What would the result of this social experiment be? ultimately? Well, this is not hard to predict. Under this arrangement, there would eventually be the victory of the Bangladeshi cell over the United States government. One can recognize the other as a collective opponent, and the other can't. One can recognize their enemy's interests, their enemy's property in a collective sense, and the other can't. And as such, meaning political force will only flow one way. At this point, I really should point out that every single person in existence knew of this problem before the advent of the Enlightenment. Heck, even the thinkers of the Enlightenment, the early Enlightenment at least, understood this concept. And insofar as they operated as individualists, it was purely a methodological and hypothetical construction. The development of the joint stock corporation after the Enlightenment and into the Industrial Revolution took full stock of this reality, the true reality of collective interests, of capital that really only had value in a large-scale sense, and of the danger of limiting liability to individuals. From this concept, we get the molding of what originally could only be described as quasi-criminal, quasi-warlord organizations like the East India Company, into what we see today as the modern multinational corporation. Now, I am a huge critic of corporate power. I see the abuses it has every day. I don't like the world that multinational global corporations are creating. And I think these forms of organization need to be confronted and reformed. But I at no point want to use this as an excuse to ignore the necessity of a collective or corporate form when organizing power. The last thing I want to do is to take a corporate interest that I can see and turn it into a collective corporate interest that I can't see. The existence of the corporation as a collective entity is the reason I can sue Johnson & Johnson when its employees lie about the danger of cigarettes. The existence of the corporate and collective form, in an understanding of its action, is the reason why we can hold BP liable for its actions in the Gulf oil spill. It's the existence of the corporation that allows for the construction of large global supply chains. And it's this reality that keeps factories guarding and maintaining their equipment, even though no individual employee benefits from it. We live in a reality that in any realistic sense has collective action. It has collective action in external geopolitics, and it has collective action in internal financial politics. Insofar as the reactionary or non-liberal critique goes, it is fundamentally a criticism of those who organize and control collective power, of those who found themselves in leadership positions over nations and national symbols, of wealth that is carried forward throughout generations, and of systems that benefit large collectivities. The critique from the right is, and for a very long time has been, that these leaders do not have a stake in the very collective properties they have been entrusted to protect for the good of society and for the good of the next generation. In essence, our problem is a corporate one. We are the stakeholders of our society complaining about mismanagement of collective goods. And to make those complaints heard, to conceptualize those complaints against the corporate entities and the government corporate entities that are responsible for the malfeasance, we need to talk in collective terms. We need to talk about groups. We need to talk about aggregate behaviors. We need to be able to talk about the long-term sustainability of our society and the long-term goods that our society holds and maintains for future generations, even if they do not pertain to specific individuals in our society right now. And we cannot do this if every single attempt to talk about a collective interest immediately gets disintegrated down into its constituent components. This individualistic model operates as myopic blinders that keep us from understanding real collective stakes that are in play in our world today. Just as it would be ridiculous to say that we cannot see the person's role when his finger pulls the trigger of a gun to kill another person, it is ridiculous to say that collective power struggles aren't actually going on, because we can decompose each of their constituent elements. We are applying individualism in this sense in a way that it was never intended to be applied by anybody prior to the late 20th century. Now, of course, I can anticipate here that I may be accused of straw-manning my opponent's arguments. I'm sure many people like Danny Duchamp will say that they see these problems, that they see collective action issues, that they see how it is impossible with always reducing everything to individual culpability, and that they understand that there are such things as collective goods, of intergenerational goods. And of course, I can't rule out that I have just misunderstood the arguments being put forward in this video. But I will say this in my defense before I close out this response. If indeed the liberalists and the individualists acknowledge each of these realities, the existence of collective value, the existence of collective rights and collective responsibilities, and the reality of collective action, if they see all of these things, they must see the necessity of words and a language to describe these problems, of a conversation that goes beyond individuals and towards relations between collectives and collective interest. I hope perhaps this video can be the first step in a conversation, because while I think this is a mistake being made on the part of the liberals and the individualists, it is a mistake that I will say again is being made in good faith. And insofar as any collective suffers from the individualist mistake being made, it is the collective that largely contains the individualists themselves. In other words, it is in the collective interest of those who cannot see collectivity to begin with. Perhaps this is a poor place to start with any kind of discussion, but it is the only option I have, because insofar as I am part of the body politic of the United States and other Western nations, I am ultimately beholden to their fate, to the decisions they make about their futures collectively. And so, as much as I might vehemently disagree with the liberalists and the individualists, as much as I might not even like some of them, I have to admit, at the end of the day, that we rise or we fall together.